Thank you for that. One of the things, I'm halfway through a pregnancy at this point, and one of the things I enjoy about it is that while my emotions are very readily available to me, I can't contain them anymore. And I'm like, choir, please. The embodiment of peace. Oh, thank you. I heard a storyteller once talk about traveling in Mexico in the rural countryside in the hills. And she said she was there around Easter, and it struck her how different the experience and celebration of Easter was. She saw men walking through town carrying enormous crosses bigger than their bodies on their backs as the sun beat down on them. And they moved through the town from one place to another, embodying and living through the stations of the cross. They were sweating, they were laboring, people were watching. It was a solemn experience. Afterwards, one of the men who had participated said to her, "And how do you celebrate Easter back home?" She said she just didn't have it in her to say, "Well, we have an Easter bunny, and we plant stuff out there, and then the kids hunt for candy." She said she just didn't have it in her to tell this man who was sweaty from laboring with a cross, "My people, we just don't celebrate suffering." In the book, Proverbs of Ashes, the UU minister, Rebecca Ann Parker, she writes about this. She describes an Easter sermon series that she gave to her Methodist congregation before she became a UU minister. And she told them that it bothered her that her people at Easter cared more about the Sunday than the Good Friday, more about the resurrection than the going through the process of persecution and suffering, of crucifixion and of feeling forsaken and suffering and dying. She suggested that they ought to linger a little bit longer in the process that led up to that morning so that they would really understand the resurrection is precious. It was a vital topic for her in her own life as she was grappling with her own process of moving through despair and pain. She was suffering with depression. She was in a failing marriage. She had recently realized that she was married to an alcoholic. She'd started attending Al-Anon, which is a 12-step program for friends and family members of those who struggle with the disease of addiction and alcoholism. She started going to therapy. She started paying attention to her own reactions to what was happening in her home. And as she did, she realized sometimes some of her reactions were about more than just what her husband was doing, but they reminded her of things that had happened in her home as a child. It had reminded her of some of the hardships she had lived through. And as she did this digging and this laboring through her own life experience, she remembered her own childhood experience of sexual abuse. And as she moved into remembering and feeling those stories, those memories, those bodily experiences, she was moving through her own remembrance of persecution and suffering. So she knew on this Easter morning that you don't get to the place of new life if you don't actually deal with and reconcile the wreckage and the torment and the suffering first. That you don't ascend if you haven't descended somewhere first. Her descent involved a lot of pain and suffering. It involved cutting herself in a hope of releasing her feelings, of feeling her feelings. It involved a desire to die. On her way down to Lake Union, where she planned to drown herself, she came across the Seattle Astronomy Club, and they showed her Jupiter. She said, "I did not defeat negative feelings of anguish and despair because I saw something more lovely and good. Rather, I just became more able to feel. My feelings broadened. Pain, sadness, and despair were not eliminated or overcome. I embraced them with a larger heart. All the feelings and memories I had couldn't be held by a decision to die. I could only hold everything with a decision to live. She says sometimes we live for a long time with a certain belief, a belief like it's best to never speak about pain and abuse in our lives. We hold fast to this belief and we live by it, but then something sneaks in and challenges it, and we see that it may not actually be the best way to live. But we defend our old belief, fearing that if we were to let go, our life would fall apart. But then we find we can't hold on. Life has asked us to let go, so we let go. We relinquish the way we have held our life together, the ideas that had guided us before. It feels like falling or dying. We are angry, we are frightened, we are resentful, but we discover that by feeling that, we can let it go, and we can open ourselves to something better. Grace comes to us, and we discover a life that is richer, freer, more joyful. We did this, and we get to feel and experience resurrection. She relinquished the resurrection of her own spirit. She also earned it. She didn't just get to skip all of this work or the process of the Good Friday of her own life to just show up and say, oh, look, it's all better now. I had one appointment with a therapist, and I named it, and now I am done. She had to live and feel her way through it. She had to suffer through it. She had to carry her own pain and burden through the days of her life, through her own town, as she sweat and toiled and labored and cried and grew angry and shameful. And as she did all of that, she preached about it. She shared this process of resurrection with her congregation. She couldn't go through this Easter pretending like, oh, look, it's just this superficial thing that we do. Let's just come and move through the rituals of our faith. She says actually that that's dangerous, that the theology of the cross, of how many Christians relate to suffering and the cross, is actually dangerous. That's the point of her book, actually. She co-authors it with a colleague, and they argue that the theology of the cross actually sanctifies violence. Here's an example. She knew a woman named Enola who was being beaten by her husband. And Enola asked her pastor, "What do I do?" And the pastor told her, "Suffer silently. This is your cross to bear." Enola's suffering and her understanding of God led her to believe that God would make it right, that God's will was more important than her own worries about her safety. The church had taught her to keep her family together, that that is what God wants for us. If he strikes you, turn and give him the other cheek, as Jesus did. Jesus didn't turn away from the cup of suffering that God gave him when he was sacrificed and crucified. You should try to follow in Jesus' footsteps. Rejoice in your suffering. It will bring you closer to God. Enola was later murdered by her husband. And Reverend Parker couldn't help but feel devastated by the fact that a church could sanctify this kind of suffering. Life is not saved by death. And the notion that you must give away your life to be saved creates mixed messages about suffering for many. Parker argues that this theology cannot offer healing to victims of intimate violence when the central image of the crucifixion is of a parent who requires the death of his child. A Universalist preacher from the 1700s, Hosea Ballou, said that this idea, this notion that nothing but the death of Christ or the endless misery of mankind could appease God's anger, is an idea that has done more injury to the Christian religion than all the writings of all of its opposers. To be like Jesus is not to be a doormat. It is to use nonviolence to show the violator and the oppressor the error of his or her ways so that they will repent, not to suffer for the sake of suffering. As such, on that Sunday morning, Parker preached that Easter is not a time to be celebrating, but a time to be grieving. A time for acknowledging the suffering in our lives. And then once we have done this and we have lamented, once we have grieved, once we have actually allowed ourselves to be in the place of Rilke's poem of pushing through what feels like solid rock, that everything is close to my face and everything close to my face is stone. That is not the moment to turn away. That is a moment that we embrace, and we hope that this great love will break in to free us. That when we do that, when we felt the reality of our lives, and we can marvel at how we didn't break in that moment, how we held all of that pain, all of the violence of our lives, and we didn't break, that is our resurrection. Parker says, how to hold all of that in our arms without being destroyed by sorrow, I do not know. Maybe music will show us, maybe ritual will carry us there. But somehow, just as Mary had cradled her crucified son in her arms and she wailed, we have to hold the bodies of Earth's violated people and voice our grief. Our grief might enable us, the survivors, to act in the world with determination and compassion. At least I hope so, she said. So on Easter morning, the kids are outside doing that. That's not the work that we are doing in here. She invited her congregation into the work of grief, to experience Easter not just through celebration, but to experience the resurrection that occurs when you actually feel parts of yourself dying. She invited people to grieve for the victims that are in us or around us, to take down the crucified and care for them, to hold our own dead places, to allow ourselves the opportunity to feel the grace of love moving in our lives, so that we are being experiential about what this message of Easter is all about. Because when we bring love to the world's broken places, or those places in us, powerful transformations happen and resurrection occurs. I read Parker and Brock's book because it was on the required reading list to become a Unitarian Universalist minister. And I admit that I was resentful and somewhat bored as I pulled it out of my bag. I thought this is going to be a heady academic theology book, so I took it on a plane ride with me where I brought no other books so that there was no escape and I would have to read it. This is a strategy that is successful in my life for those books that look and leer at me. But as I sat and read it, by the end of the flight, I was like underlining something on every other page. I was mesmerized. I was crying. I was just crying on the plane, looking around, just amazed by the courageous vulnerability and their insight into theology that's contained in this book. It's, to this day, one of the most brave and insightful books I've ever read. At the time it was published, the Reverend Dr. Rebecca Ann Parker was the president of the Star King School for the Ministry in Berkeley for 11 years. She was and is a prominent figure within Unitarian Universalism. While that might not mean everybody in the world knows who she is, for you who are church geeks like I am, we do. And I can't believe the level to which she was willing to share her personal journey through her own trauma and violence and healing. I couldn't believe how intimate she was as she tried to elucidate the meaning of this theology of the cross. I have never been so brave. Maybe with people in personal conversations, but never in a book that is contained for a long time for all people to access. Though I can relate to her story, I'm not as willing to reveal my own particulars. We've all probably encountered someone else's bad behavior. We've also probably offered others some of our own bad behavior. We've surely come across people in our lives that we want to find a way to keep out, people who don't really know how to treat us well, maybe people who've abused their access to us, who've taken things too far. In my struggles to restore peace in my own soul after such violations, I was fortunate to not only come across her book, but before that, I came across a very different book. It's called Forgiveness Therapy, an elf help book. So, yep, I like elf help series. They're really wonderful. Let me tell you a little bit about them. There's an illustrator who takes self-help books and takes maxims out of those books and just puts a sentence on a page, and next to it draws the image of a little elf. You're nodding. Maybe you've seen it. I hope I didn't just out you. But I love them. I loan them to people. I have a whole series. So they wear these little hats that have a candle held in the hat that is demonstrative of how they're feeling. So here's one of the stories that I really liked. The story began with this woman elf happily riding her bike down a one-way street. And her hat is perky and the candle is brighting up, it's bright and it's lighting her way. And then suddenly this second bike enters and the scene and it smashes right into her, clearly going the wrong way down a one-way road. And they both fall off. He picks up his bike, brushes it off, says sorry, he gets on his bike and he rides away. Well, her light is like fuming now above her head. And she is just staring at her bike and she's scowling at its mangledness and she picks it up and she carries it. The next page, you see that she has brought him to court. Still scowling with her candle burning brightly as she holds the bike and she points at the man elf who seems to really not care. I mean, he's like, oh, sorry. But his light is just normal. He's not disheveled. He's not carrying anything broken. And the judge says, here's the fine. He pays the fine, and the man gets on his bike, and he leaves. But meanwhile, this woman elf, with her sullen light, is still painfully hunched over her broken bike as she hobbles along, arms busily carrying the bike wherever she goes. And those are the images that I needed to help me see that the moments that really hurt us are moments, and they end. And it is when we carry them with us everywhere we go that we are the ones who remain hurt, not the person who did the offense in the first place, but it is us. And I had heard this about 1 billion times. Forgiveness is something you do for yourself. It's how you free yourself. But I didn't get it until those little elves made it abundantly clear what was going on for this woman. There are times when I just feel so justified in my anger. Horrible things that can happen in our lives that we can find no reasonable possibility to excuse, but they happen. It's as if she carried her bike around, like if I keep doing this, no one can ever do it to me again. As if that is going to protect her, as if by carrying it around, we can somehow control other people's actions and make sure that we no longer feel this. And yet, we are the ones carrying it around, hunched over, burdened. We are the ones who pet the bike and are hurt. We are the ones who stoke the fire of the story of the bike and keep our flames roaring. When they could be shining on a bike ride or doing something else, no, we keep them hovered over this pain. We keep the moment alive. We think somehow we're going to control what will happen. But what we really can do is only choose what to do when these things happen and how we want to live our lives. There are times we may think, whatever, that bike broke. I'm just going to completely throw it away, ignore it, and pretend like that never happened. Yet, I will never get on a bike again. I'm scared of all bike lanes. And we hope that we can just move on or move around it by ignoring it, rather than dealing with it, rather than taking the time to repair and mend the bike so that we can get back on and go about our living. The thing that I've learned about our hurt places is that when we ignore them, they tend not to heal, but to fester. We think we can let it go, but then we run into someone who looks just like her, or talks, just like him. Or, God forbid, we find ourselves saying or doing something that reminds us of that person, and we turn on ourselves and start to reject and hate ourselves. We realize in this moment that we continue to suffer years and years after that guy rode off on his bike. That in those moments, we are the ones who are hurting ourselves because we refuse to look at what's happened. To let something go, you first have to know that you're holding it. You have to look at it. You have to see what is broken if you want to fix it. You have to find the resources you need to tend it. You have to oil it. You have to grease it. You have to straighten it out. It's nice that he was able to just get on his bike and go away. But for some of us, we don't necessarily have that choice when we've been struck like that. There is work for us to do. And while it may not be fair, it is ours to accept. Parker said, "I did not defeat these negative feelings of anguish and despair because I just saw something more lovely and good. Rather, I became more able to feel, that her feelings broadened, that she found different resources to be with that mangled bike." She said pain, sadness, and despair, they weren't eliminated or overcome, but I just embraced them with a larger heart. All the feelings and memories I had couldn't be held by a decision to die. They could only be held by a decision to live, to embrace what is there. There is no way out or around the mangled bikes of our lives. There is no shortcut. I found, in fact, the fastest path is to go right towards the thing that scares me and hurts and that I'm terrified of. And like the song said, and what wondrous love is this, to hope and pray that love will accompany me and to find friends who will join me on the journey so that I'm not alone. That is how we move from being a victim in that moment to a survivor. When we move from just reacting to what happened to tending and caring for ourselves, to hold our broken places and release the hurt. That's what I've been taught forgiveness is. It is letting go of our hurt. It doesn't mean we accept that the other person did this and we forgive them in a way that says, you are welcome to come back into my life and ride your bike whichever way you want. Come into the home of my heart and destroy its furniture. Please, I have forgiven you. That is not what forgiveness means. We are allowed to set boundaries that come from a place of love and respect for ourselves. It means, though, that I have let go of the hurt, so when I'm setting the boundary, I'm not setting it in a way that says, I'll get you. Right? Instead, it's saying, from a place of love, what I need to respect and care for myself. As I could so clearly see in the face of this elf with her light, that when we resent one another, as they say in 12-step programs, that resentment, it's a poison that we take hoping someone else will die. She was drinking the poison of resentment every day of her life. When we forgive, we choose to not drink that, to set it down, to let something change. And we might discover that when we see this person again, whether they've ever acknowledged what they did, whether they've ever known that you have found some forgiveness or not, that we have done the work we need to do to let go, and we found resurrection, and it is changed. I can imagine right now you're saying, come on, Erin. It is not that easy to set down the bike. And even when I want to, it like jumps back into my hands and I find I'm carrying it around again when I thought I set it down so many times ago. Over and over again. And I know that it takes more than just decision in the head and thinking to be able to find forgiveness. It takes a process that took me a long time and often does when I experience these kinds of hurts or when I pick up the mangled bike, for it to move from my head to journey down into my heart, that acceptance can wash over me through that journey of feeling and acceptance. Reverend Parker preached on Easter one year that there is a ghostly skeleton that we must learn to dance with. We cannot live until we've learned to embrace life's realities of betrayal, violence, suffering, and grief. How to hold all this in our arms without being destroyed by sorrow, I do not know. Maybe music would show us. Maybe ritual could help carry us there. What I have found in my own life is that sometimes that process wasn't just a weekend, but it was years. Years to really honor what had been taken or what had been hurt. But all it took on my part was the slightest bit of willingness to begin. That I didn't have to know how, that I didn't have to know who could help, that I didn't even have to know how it would end. I just had to be willing to start. Where does that willingness come from? I do not know. But maybe it is the same source of resilience that we see in life when you're walking in the woods and you see a tree that has a massive boulder that has fallen on it, and yet it doesn't just start growing into the ground. It grows sideways around it and up, and it keeps reaching for the light. Meandering, growing despite all damage that it has endured. Our meditation this morning invited us to consider how we are like seeds. If you don't have a seed, I invite you to take one on your way out. They're in little bowls back above the hymnals. They're sunflower seeds. If you have one, I invite you to look at it, to feel it. What does this seed represent for you? What is it? Is there something that needs transformation in your own life? What does it need from you to make that happen? Do you have a grudge that might finally be ready to be buried over with acceptance? A seed of willingness that is ready to sprout forgiveness? Do you have a mangled bike that you are carrying around that is causing you back or shoulder pain? Do you need to look at it to actually see what is broken about it before you can truly set it down, that it can work again? Sometimes we can't let it go yet because we haven't actually seen all that needs to be honored and seen and learned from in order to go forward. Is there something that you need to look at or feel different about before that seed can be buried with acceptance to transform into something new? So in a moment, we're going to have some music to help hold us and invite us to go deeper in ourselves, to dream together of being unafraid to let the pain and the hurt go, to let our feelings release and transform. Let us practice being unafraid to let love in and receive its gifts. Sometimes resurrection is possible.